The third mantra of LegalUX is keep it light. The first thing to note here is that the language of these first three mantras creates something of a recipe for highly effective advocacy. Frame it right, keep it tight, keep it light. 1 part creation, frame it right. 2 parts protection. Protection of the creation, keep it tight, and protection of the creator, keep it light. Before discussing this third mantra, I'm going to take a moment to identify what I call the 3 axes of advocacy. The x-axis of advocacy is plausibility. What you say must accommodate both the law and the facts. The y-axis of advocacy is usability. How you communicate must actually help your users do whatever it is that they need to do. And the z-axis of advocacy is sustainability. How you do all of this must enrich and sustain both you personally as well as professionally. These first 3 mantras have introduced foundational concepts of each axis. These concepts are foundational because if you follow them, you'll have a pretty good chance of achieving meaningful success, but if you ignore them, you'll have no chance of achieving meaningful success. So, mantra number 3, keep it light. John Nelson, a pioneer of the field of user experience and co-founder of the Nielsen-Norman Group, has offered a metaphor of UX that I think about often when trying to keep it light. Imagine a wood plank. It's about 1 foot wide and, say, 100 feet long. If that plank were laying on the ground, then you could walk across it with no problem. You wouldn't think twice about it. But what if that plank were 200 feet in the air? What was once effortless would become essentially impossible. Keeping it light means keeping your planks on the ground. How close to the ground do you need to keep them? After all, the overwhelming majority of lawyers are almost incapable of keeping their planks anywhere near the ground. So it would be easy to think that just a little bit of work would go a long way. And it will. But it's worth considering how you'd approach a plank that was, say, 5 feet off the ground, or 3 feet or 7 feet, whatever the edge of your comfort zone is. You could still probably navigate that plank, but think about the turmoil you'd go through beforehand, the anxiety and the worry. Think about how much more hesitant you'd be with each step, how much slower you'd go. Think about how much higher your heart rate would be as you tried to navigate across this plank. The more you consider this, the more you'll understand just how important it is to keep your planks squarely on the floor. By keeping it light, the important thing is because keeping it light refers only in part to external filings, filings to your opponents, filings with the court, etc. But way more often than not, keeping it light refers to internal communications. Communications with your colleagues and with your clients and with your family and with yourself. Think of the value you'd add to colleagues if they came to you in a frenzy panicking about whatever. And you took their problem and you turned down the temperature and you offered a clear path to resolution, possibly even executed that plan for them, depending on your relationship to your colleagues and your law practice. Or imagine talking to your client who's hell-bent on revenge against your opponent or his opponent or their opponent in the litigation. Your client's going to want to not give any courtesy to your opposing counsel. They're going to want to scorch the earth, etc., and so forth. By keeping it light, you ensure that what you're doing will be sustainable into perpetuity. Not just for you and for your family, but for your law practice and your enterprise, for your clients, for the court, even for your opponents. Why would you worry about your opponents? Well, it is funny. Lawyers will often bemoan, a lot of defense lawyers will say, oh, these greedy plaintiffs keep filing these lawsuits. Well, you should send them a bottle of something, not actually, of course. But that's what keeps you in business. So, how do you keep it light? The key to keeping it light is a method called abstraction. When you or a colleague or a client is in a frenzy, they're invariably viewing the problem from the wrong level of abstraction. To keep it light, you must first identify the right level of abstraction. and you'll soon develop a sense of how to get you or your colleague or client to the right level of abstraction. And when we think of concepts like a sense of humor or having a way with words, this is what we mean. Understanding levels of abstraction and how to move up or down with ease. These things work because they direct the other person to the appropriate level of abstraction. How do you abstract? Well, you follow the ladder of abstraction. This is a foundationally important concept. So if you've never heard of it, Google right now, ladder of abstraction, Bessie the cow. I learned about it in a book called Language and Thought in Action. I think I even have it somewhere over here. Language and Thought in Action by S.I. Hayakawa. The book covers concepts of linguistics primarily, but it's one of these books where you can read every page, every section, and get something extremely, worthwhile. Like here's a pretty cool note here, talking about keeping your language neutral and not editorializing. The avoidance of slanting is not only a matter of being impartial, it is even more importantly a matter of making good maps of the territories of experience. The profoundly biased individual cannot make good maps because she can see the enemy only as an enemy and a friend only as a friend. The individual with genuine skill in writing and in thinking can, with imagination and insight, look at the same subject from many points of view. And then there's an example that they go on to discuss. This is just opening to like one page, and it's a wonderful book. If you haven't heard of this concept, Google it and spend some time thinking about your problems along the ladder of abstraction. Here it is in a nutshell. Imagine a farmer named Joe. Joe has lots of animals on his farm, including cows. One cow in particular is very special to Farmer Joe, and that cow's name is Bessie. Bessie has hazel eyes, Bessie's missing her 2 front teeth, and Bessie is just the apple of Farmer Joe's eye. Now, Bessie exists along several rungs of abstraction. The name Bessie represents Bessie as a cow, separate from cow Rosie and cow Ingrid, etc. The actual cow Bessie exists in the physical world, so that's one rung below the name Bessie. Bessie, the name, is an identifier of actual Bessie. And then Bessie herself comprises a bunch of atoms and electrons and other microscopic stuff. That's another rung below that. Now, that extremely microscopic level might be helpful to like a researcher studying, grass-fed versus not grass-fed, or it might be helpful to like a veterinarian or something doing a very specialized analysis of a cow. But to you and me and to just most people, that low level of abstraction is TMI. It's just way too much information that we can't do anything with. But note, this is where most lawyers operate. They dig in, they identify all of these facts or what they think are facts, and then they tend to just regurgitate them for whoever their user is. Some, like lawyers who think they're real savvy or experienced, they'll say, well, I'm just leaving the doors open so I can then figure it out later. I can always say, well, yes, I raised this fact earlier, so I didn't waive it. But more often than not, it's just laziness and an inability to think through the facts. They just plop them out, almost vomit them out for the user, and then they say, hey, you deal with it. But let's go the other way at the abstraction ladder, right? Bessie's a cow, right? So the name Bessie represents the actual cow. Bessie is a cow. Cow is livestock. Livestock is a farm asset. Farm assets are assets, and assets are wealth. So you see how we go up the ladder of abstraction or down the ladder of abstraction. And to do that, what you do is you include or omit certain characteristics that are common to others within that characterization. And that really will depend on what it is you're trying to say. And the reason you want to do this is because it allows you to compare and contrast. It allows you to then gain insights, and with those insights you can form strategy. Ultimately, the point here is you need to make sense of things, both for yourself, for your colleagues, and to the users of whoever you're writing to. The process of abstraction is how highly effective thinkers analyze situations. And it's the first step toward keeping it light. So let's take an example that I come across in my work. I do a lot of work in insurance coverage, precisely because there's not a lot of discovery. You get from pleadings to summary judgment pretty quickly. And that suits my skill set very well. Now, what almost every coverage lawyer does in any brief is they'll just either screenshot out or they'll otherwise reproduce like every provision of the policy that could possibly have any relevance. And they'll just have a section in their brief. It takes up like 10 pages, and they're like, well, here's all the, I can't possibly get into under half my page limits, of course, when you just reproduce all this nonsense. Now, the thing with insurance coverage or with any policy interpretation or contract interpretation is all you're doing is running these terms up and down the ladders of abstraction. This is also true in other practice areas as well. The example we're talking about here is just insurance coverage. So you're running the policies up and down the levels of abstraction. At least you should be. But again, most lawyers don't. They just reproduce it. And so to understand why this is so silly, like imagine Farmer Joe describing Bessie's hazel eyes and gap teeth in response to a question from his banker asking him to describe his farm assets when applying for a bank loan. Like, what are you doing, Farmer Joe? And what are you doing, including all that nonsense? What are you doing stressing about these little things that, you know, don't mean all that much, but that wear you down? Worth noting that the topic here is sustainability, not plausibility. Keeping it light refers to the sustainability of your actions. It's not meant to refer to the substantive actions of advocacy, but they're related, because the more substantively correct you are and the better handle you have on the facts and the law, the better you are on the ladder of abstraction with your understanding of these things, then invariably the easier it is for you to keep it light, the easier it is for you to not stress. You know those critical, important things that you must win on. You know what else is essentially just noise or house money that you can play with in forming your strategies. It makes it much easier for you to not worry about stuff. It makes it much easier for you to help your colleagues if they're stressed to kind of reorient and regain perspective. So when we talk about, long way of saying, when we talk about strategy here, it's not in the context of plausibility, it's in the context of sustainability. Keeping it light is probably the most effective way to establish yourself as an authority. Effective advocates know this, and they constantly struggle to find and communicate from the best level of abstraction. You remember all those case briefs that you were told to do in law school? Now, perhaps you think of those as exercises in futility. Maybe you remember them fondly because you wrote the best case briefs or whatever. However you think about it, I think about them when they're properly, in proper context, they're exercises in abstraction, because you identify the facts of a case, you identify the procedural history, the holding, etc. You're identifying the pieces, in other words, that you move up and down the levels of abstraction. And you start to learn what it is that you really need and what's really important to be considering, which variables to run up and down, or which characteristics to run up and down the ladder. In mantra number 2, I noted that effective advocates fight most, like the overwhelming majority of their battles, internally with their colleagues and with their clients, not externally with their opponents. So being able to keep it light will go a long way for you. In everything you do, work hard to keep the planks on the floor. Whatever you do, don't be like Farmer Joe.